Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our next session, Archival Research and the Future of Holocaust Studies. Our panel will bring together the perspectives of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem, and the USC Shoah Foundation to discuss current avenues of research, the future of Holocaust studies, and the challenges of the discipline. The issue of how to connect the history of the Holocaust with the stories of Jewish experiences in the Army will be addressed as well. Please welcome David Fry of the United States Military Academy at West Point, who will serve as and introduce the panel. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to the Genesis Philanthropy Group, the Blavatnik Family Foundation, and the David Berg Foundation for sponsoring this entire meeting and our session. Michael has already introduced the topic of our discussion for session 10, but we have three amazing panelists today, all scholars and innovators in the field of Holocaust studies. I'll introduce them alphabetically and only briefly. I can't really do justice to their long list of contributions, but we want to get to their contributions today, so I'll be brief. Dr. Lisa Moses Leff is professor of history at American University and director of the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her research focuses on the history of Jews in France since the Revolution. She is author of multiple books, including prize winners on French Jewish history. Dr. Dan Mishman is professor emeritus of modern Jewish history and former chair of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar Ilan University, Ramat Gan. He is also head of the International Institute for Holocaust Research and incumbent of the John Nyman Chair in Holocaust Studies at Yad Vashem, Jerusalem. His publications cover a broad range of topics, including the Holocaust and its impact, Dutch Jewish, Belgian Jewish, and Middle Eastern Holocaust history. Dr. Corey Street is the incoming interim executive director of the USC Shoah Foundation. They have spent a decade leading the foundation's academic, education, and administrative initiatives. Their current academic work is focused on the preservation and educational use of Holocaust survivor testimonies and the role of testimony in addressing the history of mass violence, working with national and international committees on Holocaust education, remembrance, and research, as well as, interestingly enough, an examination of Holocaust imagery in the Harry Potter books and film. Their other areas of research include problem-based learning and the integration of information literacy into the classroom. Last session, we heard from war museums and archives. All three of you, however, represent Holocaust institutions, specifically selected because unlike most colleges and university research centers and other museums, you possess incredible archival collections, that allow for a different kind of research to occur. So the structure of this panel is that I'll ask a question, and I ask that each panelist answer the question and try as best they can to answer it in about 3 minutes. I hope that is possible, and I expect that we'll have some really great insights. So I'll start with Lisa with this question. So all three of you are actively involved in not only your own institutions, but in Holocaust organizations and alliances. What do you believe to be the future of Holocaust studies, and how do you see the field changing? So we'll start with Lisa, then go to Dan, and then go to Corey.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the organizers, and especially to Michael Glickman for putting this all together and inviting me. David, you asked what's the future of Holocaust studies? I would say we see 4 different major trends. One is the field is becoming, over the last few decades, more sensitive to differences in different places. And that means that we move the timeline of when we think the Holocaust begins and ends, both earlier and later. And that's an interesting problem. A second trend is that again, this is a long-term trend, but it continues into the future, is seeing less rigid boundaries between different identity categories, right? So famously, Hilberg divided Holocaust studies into like the study of victims, the study of perpetrators, the study of bystanders. We've so blown that apart in recent decades. And what I see most lately is overlapping these categories. And I think that's the inspiration in many ways for this conference. And then maybe I'll end with this, more methodological diversity. So this used to be the realm of historians only. And now we're seeing more and more people bringing different approaches, even historians borrowing approaches from, archaeologists, scholars of material culture, art historians, many, many different fields contributing. And this is exciting. This is a move towards new sources and new ways of understanding. And I'll stop there and pass it off to Dan.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, David and Michael, and for inviting me. What is the future of Holocaust studies? Well, when I entered this field 45 years ago, I didn't expect that it would expand so much as it has done. So I think it will, in a way, continue, of course, with new venues. Lisa already mentioned that different methodologies are entering the field, that is from historical research in general, what we sometimes call the turns, but we have cultural, linguistic, temporal, spatial aspects that were not so central in the past. In perpetrator research in the past, the emphasis was on decision making. And I think we are much beyond it, and which also leads to a redefinition of what the Holocaust is, I would say. And that is important. But one of the major challenges that I see is also the intervention from the political arena. And that is something that was not so in the past. Of course, there were always interests, and our institutions were established by politicians in a way, but there was a segregation between research and politics. And one of the, let's say, the bad sides of the popularity of the Holocaust nowadays is that people are interested and it is central, so politicians are misusing it. Not only politicians. And this has an impact, and we have to stand fast and be strong to keep the academic aspect of the field. And I think that is one of the challenges that stands before us in the near future. But indeed, there are new perspectives. There are areas that were under-researched, right? Southeast Europe, for instance, and it is now developing. And I think there is a lot to do, and our institutions can assist in these developments.
There I was. I made a joke about muting my microphone to give myself time to think, and then I just actually forgot to unmute myself. I think, thanks you to both Lisa and Dan for kicking that off with such thoughtful and insightful answers. And, I think part of what I see happening and what we see happening here is not only a redefining of Holocaust studies, but also rethinking about what framing it is in our current educational and research spaces. One of the issues that we've all been seeing, of course, is this sense that Holocaust studies are under attack. And what are Holocaust studies? What are their, what can they do? What can they deliver? And I think the interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinarity, Lisa, you talked about so beautiful, I think is such a way to see new life in the field. So as a historian myself, perhaps dangerous to say, but to look at the ways that we can reconceptualize. And I think the use of new sources is also part of that. So looking beyond the traditional sources to new sources, to different perspectives and theoretical perspectives. I know one of the the discussions around the intersectionality and critical race theory. And there are many theoretical methodological approaches that I think could enhance and empower Holocaust studies as we move forward. And I think certainly how we access those sources is changing. How those participating in Holocaust studies are changing, the locations and the perspectives that they're bringing are going to change it. I think what I hope to see is the ongoing closer alignment between what we might say is the academic aspect of it and the more practical application element. So whether that's to the field of education, whether it's to the field of policy, or to other spaces. But I think that's an important transition that will help with the longevity of the field. And back to you, David.
You've all brought up some really interesting points that that I will return to momentarily. But as you are thinking about your institutions, how will both your archives, as we are talking about the discovery of new material and new methodologies for collecting archival information or information in general, what role will your archives play in or your research centers play as we chart out the future that you just described? So we'll start with Dan this time, then go to Corey, and then to Lisa.
Okay. I think that we all will play, and not only our institutions, there are more institutions, but we have a lot of archival material at Yad Vashem archive. There are now, I think, 2.7 million pages of data, and there are interviews and testimonies and so on. So that's enormous, and USC also have large collections. Digitization and opening them with various search engines opens new venues for research. For instance, networks of rescue. That's something that we are working on, especially with our collections regarding the righteous among the nations, and you can learn much about it. There are networks of Holocaust deniers, and these are things that you can do now with the possibilities with big data and so on. Also, projects that individuals cannot carry out. So we have two projects that are running already for several years, but we will continue also in the future, and that is mapping all the deportations, mapping all killing sites and that kind of thing. And there will be more projects also by other institutions of this kind. So we are that individual researchers will not do, but we are also platforms for individual researchers and for teams that can use our materials, and therefore I think we will play an important role within that. Of course, this needs a lot of funding. In another aspect that is not so easy, especially when you rely on limited that are given by a government or some other source, but we need to attract donors and other institutions to fund these projects.
That's amazing, Dan. Thank you. I think the areas where I think our archive will be focused on, David, and such a good question right now to think about, is really going to be around preservation, thinking through issues of methodology, access, which I'll talk about in terms of linkages, but also I think there's a responsibility on all of us to work more as partners and conveners of some of these conversations. So if we start with the notion of preservation, I think that's going to be so crucial. I mean, in particular, as we talk about these new resources and new sources that we're able to bring into the archive, new types of sources rot faster. So the fact that we're broadcasting this and then somebody might save it, this probably, several months from now will be corrupt unless somebody is ensuring that it's preserved. Digitization is like not preservation. And so when we think about all of these materials being accessible in the future, we have to think about the complicated preservation processes. We talk about a spectrum of preservation. So I think I just came out of a conversation this morning where we were talking about preserving the entirety of our 56,000 testimonies on DNA, on glass, on stone, in the cloud, and what are the implications of that. So it's going to be really hard to read a stone panel, to watch a video on stone, but the readers will come. But we have to be prepared for that eventuality, so this material can be available in perpetuity. It's not as easy as we might have thought in the past. We're doing some work right now, for example, some really incredible work around blockchain preservation what also allows us to verify. So if you think about, Dan, you raised the specter of Holocaust deniers and distortionists. To be able to verify when something has been preserved, when it's been captured, in what format, so that no deep fakes can ever happen. It can't be destroyed. Just think about what that would allow for a historian, for other resources. So I think providing those access, and I'm so thankful, Dan, you mentioned this about, we need to provide linkages. We need to create networks. We need to work together to increase access. People aren't going to be going to the archives in the way that they used to be. How do we facilitate that kind of research, make it more accessible to all levels of research, not just the high-level scholars and the academe, but the interested parties? And I think archives themselves have to start talking about these bigger questions and to convene and talk. And I love the little countdown box. I think that's my 3 minutes.
Maybe I'll jump in here because I see the countdown box too. I want to amplify what Corey and Dan were just saying. We also have sent people all over the world to 40 different countries to collect, digitize, and make copies and bring back to the USHMM archives relevant to the Holocaust. And that has been amazing. That has made it possible to look at these records alongside each other in one place and understand, the Holocaust as this large event, and imagining how you could have possibly done that before these centers that digitize existed. At the same time, I was really struck by what you were saying, Corey, about, you can't just accumulate stuff. The 20th century, Pierre Nora said, was the era of the archive where we just piled up stuff, didn't necessarily read or use it all. And that's a danger in these giant collections with millions and millions of pages or testimonies. How do we make sure that people use them and understand them in their proper context? Because of course we decontextualize them with the copying. We want to do more of this. We want to spend our time in our research center helping scholars use things, bringing things to light, not just piling them up. And one of the exciting things that has happened in the last few years at USHMM is the opening of our Chappelle Center, where researchers can go and see not only the paper archives and microfilms and digital resources, but also artifacts and testimonies. So looking at all these different kinds of things together. And for that, we need those specialists who are trained in preservation, who understand the actual material. And we have many of those on staff. So part of what we want to do in the future is, push research in that direction to take advantage of what's been collected.
There's so many fascinating ideas that I wish we had a couple hours to discuss some of these things. You've all discussed some of the different ways that your archives are changing. But will your archives change the way research is done? In other words, all of these different materials that you're potentially bringing in and the different ways you're collecting and preserving information, will that change how research should be done and will be done? We'll start this time with Corey.
Yes, excellent. Full stop. Right. I think coming from the the largest archive of audiovisual testimonies of this topic, we have changed the way that it's done. I mean, just the use of oral history, the use of testimonies to help us to understand, particularly the human experience. I think it was actually my anniversary of my work here at the USC Shaw Foundation yesterday. And I'm struck by when I started, we were doing an article with Omar Bartov about how innovative it was to use testimony in true academic research about the Holocaust. And that's still something that we will debate with people about the nature of that. I think the work we're doing with our Starling Lab in terms of what media and how media is preserved will change and allow scholars to have a higher sense of confidence that the audiovisual, and this is particularly important in the situation that we're finding ourselves as scholars in, with some of the court cases and legal decisions and places elsewhere that are being captured by nationalist ideals. But to be able to say that this is verified, that this hasn't been changed, that this is that person's memory, but how you use a memory in that. So I do think it will change. And I love what you said, Lisa. I remember having a conversation in USHMM about the Some Were Neighbors exhibit, in that the exhibit developers were amazed to find that this one photograph, when they learned about it in testimony, it completely helped us understand what was going on in that picture. So kind of an assumption had been made, but once the testimonies helped to do that, and Wolf Gruner, who's the director of our center here, has really done a nuanced analysis of Kristallnacht and in the notion of understanding what's going on for women, because we often tell history from other perspectives. So to really be able to drill down on what happened for families, what happened for women when we're focused on what's happening for men in the streets. So that's changing the perspective we bring to history. But I also think just using the material that we bring has changed and will continue to change how people look at what we believe or think we believe about the past.
I think I'm next, David. Okay. One of the things we haven't talked about yet is digital methods and how they're becoming more and more important in Holocaust studies. Earlier today, we heard Annika Valka, and she's been involved in this Holocaust Geographies Collaborative, which has done such fascinating, still doing through this NEH grant, such amazing and fascinating work. And I think, large archives like the one at the USHMM can contribute so much to that by, especially because we have these digital records. We also have, we've been working on for the last couple of decades, a large encyclopedia of camps and ghettos, which is planned to be 7 volumes. As I'm sure many of you know, we expected when we started this project that we were going to have 1,000 camps and ghettos, and we've now found over 44,000. Well, scholars who use digital methods can use some of that research that was done to do all sorts of large mapping projects and other types of digital projects. So I think one of the things that we can do as an archive who rely on digitization, right? We're really different than state archives that are deep in time and only have paper, is that we can make some of the metadata available for to advance digital humanities scholarship, and that's very exciting.
It's my turn. Yeah. I will introduce perhaps an old-fashioned approach. Perhaps due to my age, I don't know, but anyhow, a stage with a lot of technological developments. But we should not forget that the Holocaust happened in the 1930s and 1940s. Another period, and that is something is important for our institutions, the scholars, right? It's a new generation. There are in this technical environment, but I think it's important to let them see also the original sources in their context. And Lisa mentioned it before that when accessible via the internet, you sometimes lose the context of files in how these documents were produced, for instance, and that is important. And similarly, let's say academic historical research is quite modern. It's 200 years about when it entered the university. Of course, the history of historiography is very old, but the way that we approach history is quite modern. And during this period, things have changed from an emphasis on the political and the military aspects to social history and cultural history and so on. And these general are part of historiography, and some of them only entered Holocaust historiography at a late stage. On the other hand, there are were advanced and paved the way. Testimonies, for instance, that Corey mentioned already, because there are so many testimonies, and the initiative interview people started in the immediate post-war period. There are so many testimonies that we can look at early and later testimonies and all kinds of things that impacted, and that is something that other fields in historiography learn from us. Next to be modern and advanced from the technological point of view, we also have to preserve the mindset that things happened 80 and it will be 90 and 100 years ago, and that things occurred in a different setting, right? And I once had also an interesting exchange with an Holocaust who asked me about Heinrich Schnellburg, 1st of September 1939, and he said that he wanted to establish the largest line of original documents. And he asked me about how did I document. I said, well, with the copy that is at Yad Vashem. And then he said, no, I don't want the copy. I want the original and not things that were fabricated by the forces after they occupied Germany in 1945, right? So, okay, copies are showing, and at that time you had this carbon. So you have to understand that in those times there was an original and there were the copies, and you can do something with the original post factum, but when you find, then you have the original source. So you have this kind that you have to keep in mind when these things happened, and not only through the angle of our technology today.
Well, you've all brought up some really great points about some of the challenges that we face. One of them, obviously, is the problem of contextualizing information and making sure that people understand not just the little tidbit, but the broader space in which it fits. Incorporating some of this new information and possibly preserving it. Like, how do you preserve spatial information, for example? Dan's also brought up some of the problems that we always face, funding, of course. And there were a number of other issues that came up. I think the idea of that Corey brought up of how do we apply the history, or at least the knowledge that we're gaining about the Holocaust and continue to gain about the Holocaust. So what other challenges are there out there? What other things should we be aware of? The obvious one, I think, is the problem of denial. And if you would all talk about that, or any other challenges that you foresee for Holocaust studies in the future. We'll start this time. I think Dan went last, so we're back to, let me check. Lisa, yes. Lisa, then Dan, then Corey.
Great. So, I mean, the last thing you said, David, was about Holocaust denial and the challenge of denial. And I think, you know, what we see more these days is distortion, trivialization, politicization, and those are problematic and challenging in a different way because there's a deep engagement with the Holocaust, right? Deniers were very fringe, and it was the, you know, the task of institutions like ours to show the authentic evidence. Now we're talking about the Holocaust or about something with people who want to use it to ends that are, you know, it's not, they're not just providing a new angle and we have to show why. They're distorting or trivializing, and figure out how to respond to that at a time when we also want the field to keep moving forward and have new perspectives. We have to figure out where those limits are and how to engage, and do it, you know, as Dan was saying, in an academic way, and make sure that we protect academic research from the demands of politicization. How do we preserve spaces, right, for academic testing out new ideas without introducing the possibility that distorters will come into our conversations? I want to say also something about the pandemic and the challenges that we see now. You know, we see people using digital resources more than ever. And that's very exciting on one level because we created all these resources and now people are really using them. But it also, I mean, I agree 100% with Dan that that's not enough. And I'm afraid that in the aftermath of the pandemic, it may take a long time for travel to be restored to normal. And that may cause us to lose the really important sense of place that we get from traveling to workshops and conferences where we can talk more than 45 minutes and go and have dinner and really get more deeply engaged, which I think is so important. And then also travel to the places that we are researching, right? It's wonderful to have places like my research center, but you also really, as a scholar, need to encounter, if you can, the places where these records were first created. And I think it's going to be a challenge for us going forward, even after the pandemic, to make sure that people return to those important habits. And I'll stop there.
Okay. With all that Lisa said, I want to add to it that one of the challenges that was there before, but I think is very important today, that's the knowledge of languages. And because the Holocaust happened in many places and with many languages, I recall that I once wrote a tiny article on Zionist movements in Belgium, and the secretary of Hashomer Hatzair in Antwerp gave me a bunch of letters, 40 letters that were written in 5 languages. So in order to understand Hashomer Hatzair in Antwerp, you needed 5 languages. And that is a problem for many people. And I think I recently tried to count, I think, to encompass the whole picture, 28 languages. There is nobody who knows so many languages, but at least you have to know several ones, and that is a challenge for the students, of course, when they enter the field and they are enthusiastic and so on, and then they bump into this issue, which means that cooperation and teamwork becomes very important. And another challenge is also the context in which we are working. Also, of course, international outreaching, but we are working also in a local context, and we reach out to them, and people come with their local, right? And so USHMM is situated at a mall in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem is on Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, and these are different contexts. and there are different populations around that have different interests. And for us, for instance, it's very important to be in touch with the ultra-Orthodox community, which is important in Israel. They're interested in their history. And of course, in Germany, the perpetrator aspect is central. So these are things that are important. But there are already initiatives. You know, there is this international European initiative of ERI, the European Holocaust Resource. What is it? I forgot the whole name, but anyhow, since 2008, the archives are cooperating, including with an extra European centers such as Yad Vashem, USHMM, and it's now turning into a permanent organization. And there should be more of these cooperations. So I think these are some of the challenges that we.
I think one of the things I like to think about challenges is that they also provide us with opportunities. And I think as we come out of the pandemic, we are entering a time where people are, still quite isolated, experiencing new levels of trauma and re-traumatization. We've got increased forms of hate, increased stages of separation, increased tribalism or partisanship, if you will. And I think that is the context in which Holocaust studies is existing. And I think one of the biggest opportunities is to find ways not to become irrelevant, not in terms of academia and education, but just to become that archaic study. So how do we keep focus on reaching newer audiences with the understanding that this isn't ancient history, that this is an important, that this area of study can say something about the world that can be valuable. And I look at, all of the wonderful work that's being done. And one of the questions that was in the chat was asking about, what about, we're dealing with an audience that is more and more on a screen. Here we are again, I don't know how many of these presentations I've done this weekend on Zoom, but how do we leverage this environment? So virtual, artificial, and augmented reality. And then what does that mean? And I think we have to leverage those. I mean, one of the things about our Dimensions and Testimony program, and David, I think we've been doing some interesting work, research work around that with you and some of your colleagues, the notion that what the opportunity that gives a researcher to understand and to explore the archive in a different way, how that makes possible an opportunity for us to look at the totality of what someone has prepared, spoken to about their experience, and ask them more specific questions over a period of time that takes that process into account. But I think we all need to be thinking about how we don't disengage from the very world that our archives exist in, whether they're on a campus on the ancestral lands of the Tongva, or in Washington, or in Israel, how we stay connected with the individuals that are most important here, and particularly as we start to pass the generations of the survivors and even the second generation. I think that is going to be something we all wrestle with for years to come.
I'm going to jump to some of the questions that are in the chat. And Corey, thank you for introducing us to that and helping to answer one of those questions from Stephen. One of the questions comes and asks about, in addition to the problem of languages, I know from my perspective at a military institution, there's a lot of faith put into to machine learning and to things that do translation. And to what extent do you see that as a solution or a contributor to a problem potentially? We'll start with Dan this time.
know. I have to think about it. Maybe Lisa starts.
Okay.
I'd be happy to start. I mean, I think we talk a lot about it trying to be more accessible. So I think things like translation are really helpful for that. So I think that can be a powerful tool. You know, if we have a program like this and people are watching from all over the world, to have captions in different languages, it's very expensive, but it can be very valuable and in bringing in new listeners. However, a language is not just a language. I say, after trying to study Yiddish for too many years, right? Everything that you learn when you learn the language is about the people, the culture, the history. That machine learning is not going to teach you that, right? So you have to have a deeper sense of culture. You know, I'm still marveling at Dan's example from the Jews of Antwerp and the different languages that they spoke or that were spoken around them that they would have understood. And of course, there's that too. But a good scholar is going to have to, you know, it's not, you can't just have automatic translation. You really have to study and learn a history. And that's a challenge of an event like the Holocaust, right? This is not learning you can outsource entirely.
I would also say, and as to add to that, the notion of, I mean, we've talked a lot about just indexing from a transcription and using the machine learning to do the transcriptions. It can get you to about 92, 93% accuracy. But then you're still going to have a human being with knowledge in order to bring that through. That's for English. If we start to go out to the languages that have less and less, machine learning is only as good as the AI is trained. So if we're talking about, you know, something like Hebrew or Yiddish, I mean, like you're at, you know, 30% accuracy. You're not at 90% accuracy. If you're talking about, you know, Czech, I mean, all of those are so you have the tool, but then you also have to understand the limits and the opportunities of those tools, because they can, I think, move us forward, but also we have to be aware of the risks of that moving forward. And I think, you know, there is a lot of value to them, but we also have to be aware of the limitations of them as well.
I'll add to that. I fully agree with what Corey said, and especially because even regular translations are so problematic. We are now also, I'm personally involved in the translation of this large series, a German series of 16 volumes of documents on the Holocaust. And the main translations, it's not Google Translate, it's not machine translate, it is human translations, and they are problematic. You have to be checked several times, right? So this will remain, and therefore language and learning language remains important. Of course, also because of the context. I'll give you one example. They one entry from the well-known diary of Moshe Flinker from Belgium. And there is the Hebrew expression, the Jewish traditional expression of zechut. Now that is, you cannot just translate it. It has a whole history, right? What he says there is that the zechuyot of our ancestors do not defend us anymore. What is this zechuyot? This in Jewish tradition, there's that good deeds accumulate and then defend the person for bad situations. Also, the children and grandchildren and so on. And of course, the most good deeds were done by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he says, this doesn't help us anymore, right? Now, how do you translate it? So you have to know the cultural context, and that is so important, and that will remain. And we should support. Also, it's not only archives, documents, and education, but also learning languages, at least for the raising scholars.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, David, for moderating. Lisa and Corey, grateful for your participation. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to conclude this session and move into the next session. Thank you so much.